Good morning. Welcome to our Boardwalk Talk series brought to you by the Estuarium at the Dauphin Island Sea Lab. My name is Mendel Graber. I am one of the educators here at the Dauphin Island Sea Lab, and today we are coming to you from our Marine Mammal Research Lab, and we are going to chat with Dr. Carl Cloyed about manatees, manatees in Alabama, manatee research that this lab is doing, and some of the areas that they frequent, the manatee abundance in our area, and also some of the ways that you can help with their research and some of the ways that you can help manatees themselves. So with that, I am going to let Dr. Cloyed tell you a little bit about it.
Excellent. Thank you. And thanks for tuning in and listening to me talk about some of our research. As many people probably don't know, we do have manatees in Alabama. When people think of manatees, they generally don't think of Alabama, they think of Florida. But we've had manatee sightings in Alabama going back decades, over a century. And however, in the last few decades, those sightings, the numbers of those sightings have increased exponentially. And that has led to the formation of the Manatee Sighting Network in 2007, where we at Dauphin Island Sea Lab collect people's sightings and put that into a repository. And that has been very useful for our research. And typically with our manatees in Alabama, it's very seasonal. They are primarily here during the warmer months, showing up usually in April or May, and then leaving to go back to Florida in September through November. And so if you want to look up here, we have a map of one of those migrations between Mobile Bay and Crystal River. This was the very first animal that we tagged in Alabama. We affectionately named her Bama. We tagged her in 2009 in August, and that fall she went down to Crystal River. Each of these little yellow dots represents a GPS ping. And she went all the way down and wintered in Crystal River, where there's some nice warm thermal springs. And then the following year she actually returned to Mobile, and she has returned at least 9 times in the last 12 years. So one of the things that we are doing to help kind of understand what manatees are doing in this area and to help better inform management practices is we're trying to get some ideas about their ecology, particularly their abundance, or how many of them are using these waters, and where they're hanging out within these waters, the particular locations and habitats that they're using. Unfortunately, counting manatees can be quite difficult. They spend their whole time underneath water. In Mobile Bay, that water can be very murky. When they do come out for a breath, they just pop their head up, and it can be very subtle. If you don't know what you're looking for, you will oftentimes miss it, which is one of the explanations for a lot of boat strikes that occur in Florida. So the best way to count manatees is actually from the air. So what we do is an aerial survey. And if you look up here, this is the general flight path that the aerial survey will take around Mobile Bay and surrounding coastal waters. We generally follow the coast pretty closely because we know that they hang around the coast, and they rarely go out into the open Gulf water or into the open water in the middle of the bay. And when we do these, I have a few pictures here. When we do these surveys, we do them in a single prop plane. There's a pilot and then a primary observer and a secondary observer. This is our Marine Mammal Stranding Network Coordinator, Mackenzie Russell. And this is what a sighting from the air looks like.
Oh, wow.
This particular sighting occurred off of Dog River and Halls Mills Ferry. So if you guys are familiar around here, you might know that area. As you can see, it is pretty murky water, and they're also kicking up a lot of dirt as they go along.
You can see them pretty well, though. I've never seen these aerial pictures.
And this is actually a photo from over in Orange Beach, Gulf Shores area, where the water is much more clear. It hasn't kind of mixed with the Mobile Bay water. So we've done 2 primary rounds of the aerial surveys. One in 2010. It was associated with the natural resource disaster assessment after the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. And that was primarily to figure out how many manatees were in this area when that disaster happened. And then the second one we did was throughout 2019, and we did that to compare numbers to 2010, and also to do aerial surveys in each season to get an idea if maybe we are missing manatees that are here in during the cold season. And when they go out and they do that, they note the number of manatees that they see as well as all the different behaviors. And then after that data is collected, we need to do some statistical modeling to estimate the abundance, because we can't go out there and count every individual. We're just never going to be able to do that. So when we've done that, we estimated that there are about 26 manatees in Mobile Bay at any given time in the warm months in 2010, and about 34 manatees at any given time in the warm months in 2019. So there was a slight increase during that time, not a huge increase, but a few more individuals. So the next thing we'll talk about is where they're hanging out when they are here. And we've used 2 different data sets to do this. The first data set is our tagged manatees. So if you look here, we have a picture of a tag. We see the back of the manatee there, and it's connected with a belt. So we've got one belt here, and this goes around the peduncle of the manatee. And this is attached to a tether that connects the belt from here to the tag, which floats on the surface of the water behind the manatee. If the manatee does dive down, the tag will dive with it. And the belt is also specially designed that if the tag does get hung up on something, then it will break away. So that is one of our data sets. The other one is from the opportunistic sighting database. So this is all the sightings that citizens have reported. So if you have ever seen a manatee and called the Manatee Sighting Network, that gets put into this database, and that was part of the data that we then used to map where they're hanging out. And so these are home range maps. We've got on the top here, we've got data from the tagged animals. And the data from the tagged animals is basically indicating that they hang out a lot up in the delta. There's kind of these orange and red polygons, and that kind of indicates where they're spending most of their time. And they also spend a lot of their time on the rivers and creeks along the west side of Mobile Bay, particularly Dog River.
For those who may not be aware, let's point out that we're on Dauphin Island here. This is where the Dauphin Island Sea Lab is, and this is Mobile Bay.
So it's interesting to notice that they don't hang in this area. Does it have to do something with maybe the salinity of the water or the currents?
So yes, one thing that we have found is that they do prefer areas closer to shore, and particularly closer to fresher water. One of their requirements is access to fresh water. So that sets manatees apart from most other marine mammals, where most other marine mammals can get their fresh water from their diet. Manatees need to get it from their environment.
And then what's this map doing?
And so this map is the same thing, but with the data from the sighting network. And the 2 maps are very similar. Both predict that they are primarily using areas around the delta and Dog River. And then with the sighted network, we also have a little bit more over in Orange Beach.
Can you explain the sighting network for those who are not familiar?
Yeah, so the sighting network is basically a repository of all the different sightings that we get reported to ourselves. So if you are out on a river or on the bay and you see a manatee, you can call this number right here and report your manatee sighting.
So this is for individuals who are out on the water and spot a manatee. These aren't necessarily sightings from the researchers.
Yes, that is correct. So if you have reported, then that report is part of our research and has been part of our analysis, and we appreciate that very much.
And it's kind of assigned a level of certainty, right?
Yes.
So some people may see something that they think might have been a manatee, but maybe it was a
It is hard to
dolphin. Maybe you
tell.
can
Yeah.
actually go there and verify that it was a manatee. Maybe you get photographs and
Yes,
compare
so
time.
oftentimes if you do see a manatee and you're able to get a photograph and report it, please send that photo with us, because that is very valuable for us, for both verifying and just for our records.
And so maybe from some of those photographs you might be able to identify individual manatees that you've
Yes,
identified before?
If you have a good picture of the manatee, oftentimes they will have scar patterns on their back that we can identify them from.
So I notice a difference that I find to be kind of striking between these two images. The tagged manatees in the top and the sighted manatees in the bottom. And a lot of these sightings are contributed by individuals who may or may not have a trained eye for manatees. But I see a lot of sightings along the Fort Morgan, the end of Fort Morgan, Dauphin Island, and around the Gulf Shores, Orange Beach area. Is this, do you expect to see that many manatees in those areas? Do you think that may be a case of mistaken identity? Is it just the volume of eyes out there looking?
That's an excellent question. I think it's probably the volume of eyes out there and where humans and manatees are kind of overlapping a lot. And so if you see in here, we also have a lot this red in Dog River, where we're up with the tagged manatees, we only have the orange primarily. And that is probably because there's a lot of people that live along the waterfront. They have waterfront houses. There's a lot of people boating in these areas. And so there's a much greater chance that they're going to be sighted in these areas. Likewise, when we go out to, again, Dauphin Island, Fort Morgan, there's going to be a lot of people out there. There's going to be a lot of eyes. And then likewise, this particular little hot spot right here in red, that is Perdito Pass. And there are lots of beachgoers there. There's lots of boaters there. There's like a couple little islands right there where people go and party. So again, there's a lot of eyes there.
And so, sorry.
I was going to say that this has the potential to bias this data set. However, when we've done these analysis and we looked at things like population density, distance to boat ramp, we still see a similar pattern between the tagged manatees and the sighted manatees. However, with things like density of human population density and distance to boat ramp, we have a slightly stronger relationship in the sighted manatee. So we're kind of seeing that bias a little bit.
Could those sightings along the beach area, can that also be part of their migration as well?
Yeah, absolutely. It's not that they're not using it. They're obviously using it because people are seeing it and reporting it. It's just that they may not be using it as frequently as it seems if you're just looking at the sighted.
So they may not be lingering there. They may be passing through on their way up to the delta and the river areas where they're going to linger more.
Exactly, yeah.
And when you get the calls, do you ever, does the lab, some of the folks from here with the Mobile Manatee Sighting Network, does anybody ever go out and try to, out into the field in response to a call?
Yes, sometimes, like if we are getting calls from a lot of areas, we will go out there and do habitat sampling and look to see if we can find manatees out in that area. And a lot of this brings up a good point. that there is a lot of overlap between the areas that manatees use and the areas that people use. The delta, a lot of these rivers along the west end, as well as out along Orange Beach, lots and lots of boaters, lots of waterfront properties of people where people live, and this can create some issues. One is that potential vessel strikes. So if you are out on the water and you do see a manatee, the best thing to do is just slow down and give that manatee a lot of space. We recommend giving at least 100 feet of space. And don't follow or harass the manatee. Just let the manatee do its natural thing. If the manatee comes up and swims past you, that's fine. Just don't approach it. Don't harass it. Let it do its own thing.
And harassing doesn't necessarily mean like poking at
it. It could just be walking up to it, swimming with it. Anything where you're kind of intentionally interacting with it. What we do recommend is that you observe from a distance, ideally around 100 feet. Again, if they do come to you, that's fine, but don't approach them and don't try to interact with them. And report your sightings to the Manatee Sighting Network, where we've got our phone numbers here. And also, if you do live around Mobile and you have a dock, a waterfront property, we do have signs that you can get from us to put up on your dock that can help just make people more aware that there are manatees around and to be aware of them. That's one of the biggest things I think that we can tell the general public to help is just be aware that they're out there. And if you do see them, drive the boat a little more slowly, maybe do no wake around them, and respect their space.
We have a few questions coming
Yep.
in. Matt asks, why does Bama use the Intercoastal Waterway sometimes instead of staying out in the Gulf during her migration?
That's a great question. It is probably likely an easier access to get through the Intercoastal Waterway. So what he's asking here is, instead of going out this way and going along here, Bama has used this little, what's called the Intercoastal Waterway for boats that runs between Mobile Bay and Perdito Bay over here. And a lot of dolphins use this. It's a pretty direct route. It's probably a lot more fresh water. There may be some more submerged aquatic vegetation in there that they can access. But I think it's probably just an easier way in and out of the bay for them than to go around, all the way around Fort Morgan and up into the bay, where when they enter that way, they're also going to be out in the middle of the bay. Whereas when they enter through this waterway, the Intercoastal Waterway, they can get a better access to the coastline to follow up to the delta.
So you have this map of Bama's tag locations, and you can see this migration between Mobile Bay and Crystal River. Is Bama the only manatee that you've tagged?
No, we have tagged 11 or 12 manatees, and a lot of them have made pretty much this same trip. They don't all do it, and they don't all do it every year. We had one manatee who took a year off and decided this summer in Florida, but then the following year came back to Alabama and has come back in multiple years since then.
Okay, Neil asks, why do manatees have a small migration?
So, at
That's
least for
relative
these,
also.
yes. So this is considered a pretty long migration for a manatee, and typically they don't necessarily need to migrate great distances to get food or to find mating grounds. A lot of it is that they're fairly limited in the winter time. They have to get back to some sort of thermal refuge. Most of them, particularly in this area, most of the manatees go back to Crystal River, where there are some hot springs, and there's some old power plants that produce effluent that is warm, and the manatees can stay there. Because once the water temperatures start to get below 20 degrees Celsius, they generally cannot survive for long. Their metabolism shuts down. So a lot of it here is related to basically how far can they go, hang out for a little while, and then get back to their wintering spot.
So the benefit to the manatees to make that migration is to look for available food, habitat resources.
Probably.
And they're, the thinking is that they're restricted in the winter by temperature. So those that linger in this area too long may experience cold stress.
Yes, and so in some years we've had animals die from cold stress because they didn't get out of here in time. And we've also had to do rescues where we've gone out and found a manatee who hasn't left and taken it to Florida. It does provide a lot of food resources. They just then have to get back.
Abandon it to get back to the warm water.
It's a trade-off, and it can be risky, particularly for those who want to wait until the very end. I do know that when they start to head back to Crystal River, if they leave earlier, if they leave in like August or September, they're a lot likely to take a really slow trip back, and they'll stop at a lot of different places as they go. But if they wait until November, then they're more likely just to book it straight back to Crystal River.
So we have another few questions. Do those sighting areas match known seagrass areas or other kinds of habitats?
So yes, particularly submerged aquatic vegetation. We don't have a lot of seagrass here. Certainly not to have a population of manatees. So they eat a lot of different things here, not just seagrass. And so all along Dog River, there's lots of submerged aquatic vegetation. And then throughout the delta is basically one big blotch of
so that would be freshwater submerged aquatic vegetation. The seagrasses would be marine.
The seagrasses that we get are more likely to be out here in Mississippi Sound and over here in around Orange Beach and Perdito Bay.
And is the difference between submerged aquatic vegetation and seagrass, one's more freshwater than saltwater, or is it the type of it?
Both.
I think it's both. It's just that we generally refer to the submerged aquatic vegetation very generally because we don't have a lot of seagrass. So it's just basically anything that is growing. If you want to look at that picture from Fallow River, you can see a lot of submerged aquatic vegetation. And that's all going to be freshwater associated vegetation.
So in the ocean, the only submerged aquatic vegetation is seagrasses.
There's more particularly as you start to go down to Florida, but there are still other types of submerged aquatic vegetation in more marine environments.
So we have another question. How much does a manatee eat?
That's a good question. Quite a bit. I don't know how much they need to eat on a daily basis to maintain themselves.
Does it vary seasonally?
It probably does. So as they get colder, their metabolism slows down. So they're probably not eating as much. And at the extreme that they are in cold stress, so in waters under 20 degrees for prolonged periods, then they will quit eating it all because their metabolism isn't working. And so a lot of times when that happens, the food that they had been eating previously also just sits in their gut because it's not being metabolized.
So how does the temperature from these hot springs and the power plants compare to summer temperatures in Mobile Bay?
So actually, the temperature around those power plants can be in the mid-20s, I believe. And here, the water temperature will get into the 30s until like 30, 31 degrees. Celsius, yeah. Sorry. So the thermal plants is probably around 72 degrees, and then the water temperature here it's a bathtub 80 degrees.
So now we're talking
85
summer
degrees.
temperatures for Mobile Bay
Yeah.
versus the water that
Yeah.
they're going to find in the.
It's going to be
I was just
much-
wondering if it was,
it's going to
you
be
know.
colder
Yeah.
in those warm water refuges
Uh-huh.
than it will be in the summertime here.
And then what are the wintertime temperatures in Mobile Bay?
The water temperatures can get down between 10 and 15 degrees, so they can get down into the 40s and 50s, which is much too cold for them.
Mm-hmm.
It's possible that they are getting, that they can find some warm water refuges here. We haven't located those. And if you guys know of any, then please tell us. But we do have evidence that within the last few years, they may have had several individuals successfully overwinter here.
Oh, really? Interesting. I had not heard that. So there was a question that's maybe there's a lot of variability in the answer to this. It's kind of a broad question, but how long can a manatee survive in cold water?
It'll depend on the cold water, but they can generally survive a few weeks. So we have a few weeks when we if we can find them and they're still in fairly good
And
condition.
what is cold water? So how would you define
I'd say
cold water?
For the manatees, it'd basically be anything less than about 68 degrees.
Okay. And would that depend on like how cold the water is and how maybe how much fat
Particularly-
stores the manatee has? What?
Yeah, so kind of what condition the manatee is
Mm-hmm.
as the temperature drops. So if it is in really good condition, it does have a lot of fat stores, then it could probably survive longer. Whereas if it's not in the greatest condition and it doesn't have as many fat stores, then it's probably not going to last as long.
So that we should probably interject that the fat helps keep it warm.
Yes, and as well as maintain energy, because it'll break that fat down to try to maintain its energy.
Mm-hmm. So can you tell me more about the manatees that you've documented overwintering in the area?
So we're not 100% sure, but we do have fairly good evidence that there have been some manatees that have overwintered, potentially in the past few years, along Mississippi and Louisiana coasts.
Oh, okay.
It's basically like we've just seen sightings of them throughout that period.
Mm-hmm. So they weren't in Alabama. Were they associated with any kind of warm spring? Or
We're not sure.
Okay.
We're still trying to figure that out.
We got some other questions. How far west have manatees been sighted? So are they all going back to Florida, even the ones that are
Around here, all the ones pretty much go back to Florida. There's also some that come up into Texas from Mexico.
okay?
For our individuals and for the individuals that we've tagged, the farthest west we've had is they all go to Lake Pontchartrain.
So the ones that overwinter in Florida some of them might go as far west as Lake Pontchartrain.
Yeah, Louisiana area.
Okay, and then there are others that are coming north and
North. Yeah.
along the Gulf Coast from Mexico.
Mhm.
Okay. And so we've got some, several questions here. I'm
Yep.
looking through. Can we report manatees we see anywhere or only in Alabama waters?
Please report them anywhere that you see them along the Gulf Coast, particularly along the northern Gulf Coast, so along the Florida Panhandle, all the way over to Louisiana. Please report all of those if you do see them in that area. We like all that data.
Why are the tagged manatees not transmitting along the eastern shore waters? I think that was, maybe we sort of addressed that earlier, but I think that question is.
Yes, so I think that they're just not using those areas as much. They're probably just traveling up and down it, so that's not one of the areas that they're spending most of their time.
So, before this program was started here at the Dauphin Island Sea Lab, there were reports of manatees in Mobile Bay historically, but the data, there was not a good system of reporting or a repository for that data. But can you kind of separate out your estimates would would be kind of hampered by that lack of data. But can you give some sort of estimate of the increase in abundance? I mean,
so
even though you
I've
have
tried to do that, and we have not been successful. I don't know like what the abundance might have been 40 or 50 years ago. I'm guessing that the abundance would have been less than it is currently, for a few different reasons. One is that the population in Florida has increased. So I think part of the reason that we're seeing more here is that because the population in Florida has increased quite a bit. So there's just more manatees there that are going to be coming up.
So there's good abundance data, historic abundance data for the ones in Florida?
Florida, going back to at least like the 80s,
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
And so can you talk about some of so we're now talking about longer range trends in manatee abundance. Can you talk about some of the things that impacted their abundance historically?
So one big thing is probably seagrass. So kind of at the same time that these manatees populations were increasing, there's a lot of seagrass restoration.
What kind of time period are we talking here?
We're talking like 90s, 2000s. And then in addition to that, there were a lot of manatee reserves. So either areas where boats were not allowed to go, or areas where boats had to drive very slowly and no wake zones essentially. And this allows the manatees either a space where they don't have to worry about getting hit by boats, or it allows them more time to respond to incoming boats. Because there's been research that has shown that manatees do respond to boats, and the more time that they have, the more time they have to get out of the boats.
So they don't move very fast, but they can hear the boats?
Yes, they can hear the boats coming, and they will move out of its way if they can.
Okay.
Unfortunately, they cannot always do that, and vessel collisions have been one of the larger source of mortality, at least in Florida.
Okay, so you're talking about maybe some of their rebound, some of the reasons that the population has started to rebound. But what put them in that position? What were some of the things that put them in that position of having the diminished population size?
I'm not 100% sure, but probably just reduced habitat.
Were they
probably
hunted
primarily.
like whales were hunted?
Not as much, no, and particularly not in the United States. In other areas, people will hunt manatees or different species of manatees than we have here, but generally not in the United States.
Were they hunted by Native Americans before the Florida was settled by?
I don't know the answer. It's a good question.
So a lot of the pressure on the manatees that caused their population decline was a loss of their habitat and their food.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I believe so. And then if you have been paying attention to the news, unfortunately, this year has been a very large mortality event for manatees in Florida. And the primary reason they think for this is that they are running out of food, which would be one potential explanation as why we're getting more manatees up here, is if they're running out of food down there, then they need to come up here and get some food.
And when you say they're running out of food, is it because the people are destroying their habitats, or they're overeating, or
probably a combination of both. A lot of those bays, it appears that is predominantly like seagrass and aquatic vegetation, and in some of those bays, it looks like it's kind of flipping from being dominated by that type of vegetation to algae that is floating, which makes the water more murky and dark and prevents the plants from growing, which then they don't have anything to eat. That's at least kind of the tentative explanation for the current mortality event.
So do the manatees eat algae or seagrass? I mean seaweeds?
No.
Okay. So I think that we should maybe bring up climate change and expanding ranges, because you know, some people might think of that as a you know, as a potential reason that manatees might expand their
absolutely
range.
As these waters become warmer, and particularly as they become warmer for longer periods of time throughout the year, we're seeing manatees particularly stay longer, so that like the last sighting that we'll see of the year, or the time that the tag manatees will leave, has been kind of getting longer each year. And then, as I said, it's possible that we may have had some manatees overwinter in the last few years. So again, that is potential evidence that as the climate changes, as these waters become warmer, they'll be spending more time, and potentially more of them will be coming into these waters.
So we have a comment from Greg, who was one of our educators here at the Dauphin Island Sea Lab. We have a teacher workshop being conducted here at the lab, and he said, we have a teacher here who is from Central Florida, and she tells us that the manatees were hunted by the Native Americans.
Okay,
and I do recall reading that, but I'm not sure what the hunting pressure was on the manatees. So
I'm not 100% sure either. I mean, it makes sense that they would hunt them, because they are very large meals, essentially. And they are not usually very aggressive. I'd say usually, because that's not always the case. And keep that in mind if you want to go swim with them. They are very, very heavy.
And another question is, what is the population size of manatees in Florida? So you just referenced like an unusual mortality event for them this past year, and probably tied to a loss of food.
Yeah.
But could you do like a before and after?
I don't know exactly how many have died within the last year. I want to say the last estimate for the statewide for Florida was 6,000, in the 6,000s. There's between 250 and 300 residents in Crystal River. Most of the manatees in Florida are actually on the east coast of Florida.
Okay,
So,
I didn't realize
and
that.
the east coast of Florida, as well as the southern part of the state.
So then is there like a minimum number that there is determined to be an unusual mortality event?
Like how many have to die for it to be an unusual mortality event? I believe the technical threshold is 2 standard deviations above the normal stranding rate. I don't know what that is in Florida.
Could you give us like an order of magnitude kind of thing, though? Are we
we're
talking
having,
like 100?
Hundreds of them die in Florida.
Hundreds of them this past year?
Yeah.
Out of the population of 6,000?
Yeah.
So that's very significant.
Yeah, no, it's a very large event that is has been unraveling this year.
Is there anything that you would like to kind of leave folks with as kind of a parting message, or a big picture message?
You know, that as you know, we were talking about climate change, we really see manatees as being like sentinel species for climate change in the northern Gulf of Mexico. Because not only are we seeing more and more manatees, but we're also seeing more and more types of fish, tropical fish species, as well as more tropical plants. Mangroves are starting to become more common. And so, in many ways, these manatees are kind of acting as a sentinel for potential tropicalization of the northern Gulf. So what I mean by tropicalization is basically these more tropical associated species moving up in latitude as climate change progresses.
Well, thank you so much for chatting with us this morning.
Yes, thank you for listening and for asking so many awesome questions.
And thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you again for our next Boardwalk Talk.